Welcome everyone to See My Face. We'll specifically be talking about the huge awarding gap between white and minoritized students right across higher education and what this means for students and educators, what anti-racist initiatives FACE has been creating with the help of white associates. So I'd love to welcome also Pascal and John. We are going to make a quick introduction of ourselves, so I will start. My name is Caryn Franklin. I've worked in the fashion media for around 40 years, and I'm visiting professor at Kingston School of Art. I have long grey hair in a plait. I'm wearing a tomato orange shirt, and I have big dark rimmed spectacles. Pascal, over to you.
Thank you, Caryn. My name is Pascal Matthias. I am a senior fellow at the University of Southampton, working on the Winchester School of Art campus. I teach within the Fashion Marketing with Management course, and I'm also the co-founder of FACE, Fashion Academics Creating Equality. I am wearing a white t-shirt. I am, or identify as Black British. I have short dreadlocked hair and a thick greying beard.
Thank you, Pascal. John, over to you.
Hi, I'm John Tatam. My relevant experience for this session is that for the last 5 or 6 years, I've done a lot of work at Kingston University, but also with 5 or 6 other universities, focused specifically on the attainment gap, the awarding gap, and devising ways of bringing the message and the reality of the awarding gap right down to course level, where we found it's been most effective in really forcing academics to recognise this isn't just a kind of general problem out there somewhere, but it's something that affects them and their students significantly. I like to think I'm a relatively youthful 70-year-old white guy with still enough curly hair to cover my ever-growing bald patch. And today I've got a cold, so I might sound a bit odd.
We get you. We feel you. Thank you for joining us. So we started this summit with the film Disclosure, and this featured the voices of minoritized academics. A really oppressive space, which must be challenged. But this also dovetails and relates to the experience that our students and young creatives are having. And Pascal, if I can bring you in, last year at FACE, I'm also a member of FACE as a white member. We focused on challenging the experience and through sort of the lived experience of our young Black and brown creatives. So I'm going to put the first slide up. If we could talk a little bit about why we did that, what we found. We reached 881 students, didn't we, from 50 different institutions?
Yes. It was really important for us as a group to actually reflect the varying and nuanced lived experiences of our students. Far too often, I would argue that the student experience gets marginalized and minoritized within institutions and academia statistics. So we're very heavy on data within academia, but the vision and those stories which exist within a very small but very significant sector of academia are usually lost, silenced, or marginalized. So from the 881 students, there was a breadth of both white students, Black students, and students that identified as Chinese, Southeast Asian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, etc. And it's really important to hear these voices. Often, and I chair the Access, Participation and Progression Board at my university in Southampton, and far too often we talk about how this data is so minuscule that it doesn't have an impact. What we found from the survey, the See My Face survey, is that although you might have maybe only 5 to 10% of students that identify as non-white, they have very different experiences from the majority, and these voices are lost. So the starting point was to ask for very simple, very direct questions, and the aim was to understand the cultural experience within academia for all. The first question talks around, did students think that they were taught by a diverse and unbiased and inclusive teaching body? The interesting, and we'll talk about the data, what we wanted to find from that was how and what is the impact of being taught from possibly a white-centric optic within academia. The second question we asked was, how did they think their academic progression was, and how was it impartial, unbiased, and equal? So how did they think that the impact of possibly having that more marginalised, minoritized experience affected their grades? And we will talk within this conversation more around the impact of having a non-diverse body of academics teaching minoritized and marginalised students. The third question was, did students feel that they were able to study an unbiased and inclusive curriculums? There's lots of work and lots of conversations which we see in the media around decolonising the curriculum. But how has that, for decades, for centuries, you could argue, impacted students? What is their experience of a student paying near on £10,000 and knowing at the onset that their curriculum is not inclusive? And what does that do when we start to talk about narrowing the attainment gap or the awarding gap, when we already know that the curriculum possibly isn't inclusive? That's problematic. And the fourth and final question was, did you feel, and for me possibly the most important question, did you feel that you were part of a diverse and unbiased and inclusive culture? And obviously we talk about the findings that we had, but these questions are not being asked through the National Student Survey. These questions have never been asked. So how can we then talk about success? How can we talk about equality? How can we talk about quality when the inequality is already embedded through academics, institutions, and a non-inclusive curriculum? So it's really important for us to get the voice of the students to share these findings.
And it was interesting, wasn't it, that the area with the greatest disparity between white and minority students was in the ability to study a diverse and unbiased and inclusive curriculum. So that gap was greater than 10 percentage points in terms of agreement and disagreement. And that sort of really does flag up, doesn't it, where the discomfort and the issues are, that for a lot of people there's no recognition at all. A lot of white students and academics, there's no recognition that this is a really uncomfortable space. And I think that was one of the key things that, you know, when we look at the findings, that and you talk about the importance of the qualitative information, not the numbers, the outpouring of frustration and emotion, and the psychological trauma that is possible to read. And for everyone tuning in, this is a study that can be downloaded from the We Are Face website, and it's under resources. It says "See My Face." So, Pascal, would you like to speak to the findings?
Yeah. So, you know, the biggest gap, is like you said, was through the satisfaction. Question 3, people being able to study a diverse and unbiased and inclusive curriculum. That was where the widest gap in terms of white and black students, the disparity there. So in terms of the curriculum and what we're seeing around decolonized curriculum and all the work that we're seeing, is that students have felt, not just with the quantitative data, but from also the qualitative data that we found, students have felt that they've not been able to study a curriculum that reflects their own personal experiences. So imagine that student that is going into any institution paying exactly the same, but not seeing themselves reflected. You're already behind in terms of the race, in terms of what you can study, but also how the curriculum is structured. So if you have a curriculum that is structured, which is biased, I would argue, then it becomes very difficult. So the attainment gap and the awarding gap will be there already. We talk a lot around diverse reading lists. We talk around intersectionality within curriculum, but it's not been embedded. And what I would argue is why not? It's the what next and the why not, in terms of we have a system within academia that look at external examiners, which look at quality and assurance, but nowhere has there been this analysis of what does your module or your curriculum or your course need to entail. But mostly the work is done of looking at data and thinking, oh yes, there's an awarding gap, there's an attainment gap between black and white. And although we're talking about race here, there's also the intersectionality of gender. There's also the intersectionality of age, care leavers, people with a declared mental health. So when you start to compress this, you see the gap widen. And it's one of the only areas where there has been some work where some of the gaps, awarding gaps between mental health, declared mental health and non-declared mental health have narrowed. In terms of white and black, that gap has increased. And what we see is that within the pandemic 2020, that gap for my university narrowed or stagnated slightly. But that was possibly because of the democratization of how students were assessed. But when we've gone back 2021, the data suggests that then that has grown again. So the findings are really, really interesting from black to white, where you see actually white students more often say that they feel part of a culture within university, but people that identify as non-white do not see themselves as part of the culture. And if that's the starting point, if you do not feel reflected, if you do not feel welcome, if you do not feel recognized, then that emotional and the trauma surrounding that will impact you emotionally, economically, etc., within how you work within an academic system. And I think one final thing I'd like to say, this is not new. This is not something that we conducted the survey very, very quickly. Within 1 year, faces a very new organisation since 2020. And what I would question is the immediacy from a quality and assurance point of view in terms of understanding the nuances between white and black students. It's not been there. We've pressed for this. I think universities are doing very good work, but I think there's still a lack of immediacy that is impacting students each and every day. And I think that although it's good work that has been done, it's possibly conciliatory because it's not doing the current students that are paying and looking to attain high grades first or 2-1s. It's not really helping them, and that's problematic.
John, before we bring in your slides to talk specifically about your findings, I wonder if you also want to comment on our findings. Just breaking them down.
I want to back them up. There's quite a lot of other research now. There's a big study done by King's College looking at all the academic studies to what was behind the attainment gap, the awarding gap. And as you've said, a key issue was about the curriculum. The curriculum didn't feel like it talked to their experience, minoritized students' experience. Secondly, that they as Pascal has said, had a different sense of belonging to that institution. It felt much more alien to them than to the white students. And thirdly, that they had different relationships with staff in the institution. And as I think you've said, these are things that staff and other white staff and white students are just not aware of. This is not obvious unless you kind of think about it and probe and you listen to the experience, as you've said, of those minoritized students. You think, well, this is just a normal university, a normal course. what's the big deal? But once you talk to students, as you've done, you realise their experience of that institution and its courses is very different. And, I'm going to go on to say that there's a major impact of that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to say, when I read some of the findings, they were quite heartbreaking. And, when we began looking at, first of all, how we racialize blackness, how we racialize whiteness, most of us who are white, and I did it at the beginning, I didn't include my race identity, but most of the white students, when asked to comment on their race, kind of put NA, like nothing to say. Whereas for minoritized students, there was just a huge outpouring of race associated with struggle. And then, we moved to the knowledge curated through a white lens, and there was a lot of fear for students of colour, racially diverse students, because straight away they felt, I'm not being understood. The work I'm doing is not being understood. We don't have a kind of a collaborative exchange, and therefore I'm fearful of how this impacts on my grade. And that fear wasn't there for the white students. And that feeling of being the only person in the room who could explain why something was problematic. Black and brown students often felt that they were the ones that had to explain issues of appropriation, issues of microaggression, and that suddenly it was all on them, and the room was focused on them to educate not just their peers, but the educator in the room. Which, again, coming back to the film Disclosure, really does speak to the lack of black and brown academics for minoritized students to make an authentic association with. And then, Pascal, I'm sure you must have been as deeply concerned as I was to read of the observed behaviours of white teachers and white students unchecked by the system.
It's really interesting, Caryn, because I've just come off the back of a lecture where my students, level 1 students, level 4 students, first year students, have just come in, and we are all looking at Black influenced, Black owned brands. They, one of the comments was, I didn't realize that the course would be so political. I didn't realize that actually, we would be talking about these issues. And my question and this was from a white student who's a fantastic student. And I said, what do you mean by political? And they said about talking about race and talking about optics. And I said, would you have thought about race and optics if we were looking at Eurocentric luxury brands like Gucci or Burberry or Balenciaga, for example? And she said, no, I wouldn't. And the point is that myself as a Black academic or an academic will have to force the issue of looking through another lens, because my argument is, if you were going to enter a global fashion economy without knowledge of diversity, inclusion, belonging, then how are we preparing our students? How is academia preparing our students to be more inclusive? The problems that we see externally, if you want to look at, external and an academic kind of paradigm, if we are discussing how we then prepare our students for the fashion environment, then they need to be aware of these, what they call political, social, emotional, racial issues within fashion. So what we're seeing, and from what the survey has given us, and some of the data is so rich, is like, there's no experience of race being taught. There's no experience of race from the academics, are diverse, and we talk at FACE a lot around recruitment. Number one, recruitment and human resources. I spend all day with and talking, saying, how do we become much more diverse? Because these conversations will only happen if we then start to force them. And that doesn't mean that you have to be black per se. It does help to have that conversation, and we have a very strong part of FACE of the white academics that within FACE have been fantastic, but they have then taken it upon themselves to force these issues, have these conversations, look at learning outcomes that say, actually, when you produce a piece of work within a module, you have to include a diverse series of thought looking at race and its impact on fashion. Until this point, there's nothing around diversity. There's obviously nothing around environmental issues either. So there's so many issues of what actually are we measuring when we talk about success of who? And that is that Eurocentric white centricity that says this is success. And what it does, it marginalizes all the voices, all the experiences. So then what we see when we see fashion brands in luxury like H&M having t-shirts which are biased, the coolest monkey in the jungle and a black person, or the blackface jumper that we saw within luxury, or all of these other examples, you think these people are not prepared because they've not been in that position. And that's the failure of academia. I think academia has to do better to prepare people for the world of fashion. It really does. And our data speaks of that around how people feel that they've been created through a white lens. There's an absence of black and brown academics. And this has got to have an impact, finally, not just on black students, but all students. I try not to make that distinguish kind of narrative between black and white and having this binary polemic discussion. It's a cultural impact. If we're talking about fashion, which appropriates from black culture so much, how can we then not teach from that position? How do we just say, actually, it doesn't matter, when clearly it does, not just for the black students, but for all students?
Yeah, I
just
think
that's
go on, John.
Point of view, we need to be preparing all our students to succeed in an increasingly diverse world, don't we? I mean, that is, you know, if in fashion, if you're kind of missing out, you know, half the world, then that's pretty hopeless. You know, leaving aside all the moral arguments about it.
Yeah, I sometimes align it to, imagine you went into university and you were all just taught from men, and you just reference from books by men, and then you only could do men's wear. You know, it would be so narrow. But what we're seeing is you could come out with a first-class degree from a very top university and never have referenced a black author.
And you only had to cut men's hair, you know.
Yeah, it's strange. It's very, very strange.
And this is something the students themselves kind of flagged up, that they felt they were missing opportunities to future-proof the industry against racism and against a kind of a narrow Eurocentric perspective, because they weren't being given enough culturally competent knowledge, vocabulary, and an environment to work in. John, if I could bring you in then for you know, the work that you have been
Fine, thank you.
Talk us through it.
I mean, you know, what we've been talking about, as Pascal's already said, has a direct impact on people's academic success, a very big impact. So I'm just going to give a bit more data behind that, reinforcing it. But I wanted to start on a slightly more positive note for once, which is that in terms of participation, HE have actually done pretty well. We've now reached the position where more minoritized school leavers go to university than white students. So I think, you know, that is I was surprised by that, but that is a success. Though, you know, they don't tend to go to the so-called better universities, but then neither do kids from comprehensive schools who are white or working class. So we know there's a lot more work needed there. But in terms of sheer numbers, I think that is a positive. However, what isn't a positive, of course, is what happens to them when they get to university. So if you put the next slide up, Caryn, they experience a whole range of disadvantage. So minoritized students are less likely to achieve a degree at all. They're less likely to gain a first or upper second, a so-called good degree, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on most. It's a pretty good indicator of people's experience and attainment at university in general. They're less likely to move on to graduate employment. They're less likely to move on to research, particularly non-taught research. And they're less likely to get employment at all than white students. So all those are pretty big issues, major disadvantages. But focusing on the attainment gap, the awarding gap, I've taken the figures from 2019 because, of course, with COVID, there's been some pretty unusual results coming out of universities, some very high levels of good degrees awarded all across the board. But going back to 2019, which is typical of years and years and years before that, 81.4% of white students got a first or 2-1. This is nationally. And these are all UK domiciled students. And 68% of minoritized students got a first. So a 13.4 percentage gap. That's not small. But what makes it even bigger, in my view, is when you look at it another way, which is to say that actually means that 20% more of the white cohort achieved a first or a 2-1 than a minoritized cohort. So if we go on to the next slide, Caryn. Can you move up the slide on, Caryn?
Is that, I thought I'd got that, the minoritized attainment gap. Would you
No, that's it. Thank you. No, that's it. Yeah. So, you know, I'm going to keep talking about this, but this is huge. That gap is huge. It's long-standing. It's got a little bit less, but it's still very, very long-standing. It's been known about for a long time. And it's so much bigger than, you know, the gender gap or the class gap. I'm sure if you ask people, actually, if you'd asked me 7 or 8 years ago before I got involved in this stuff, what's the most significant gap? I'd have probably said, oh, I think there's a gender gap or maybe a class gap. No, by no means. This way exceeds that. And one of the most astonishing things for me is, of course, there was a huge variation. We're lumping non-white students together, and of course there are a huge variety of different experiences and backgrounds. But in all ethnic groups perform less well than white students. And for me, this was absolutely astonishing because I've got something of a background in local authorities and schools. And I know that in schools, minority students, whether they're Chinese, who are way, way out ahead, Asians, even Pakistani boys, are all outperforming white students. And yet somehow, when they come to university, even Chinese students are doing less. They're doing better than Black African, but they're doing less well than white students. So to me, that is, you know, that's quite astonishing. That should be the case.
Yeah.
So if we just move on to the next slide, Caryn. So, okay, you know, why is this and why has it been ignored for such a long time? Well, I think for a long time, I think there are issues about people just being uncomfortable to talk about race, and these are liberal institutions, and, you know, they can't be doing anything which is disadvantaging people because of their race. It's something else that's causing that. So we tended to see the student deficit model, and perhaps they're coming in with, you know, lower grades, or there's something to do with their class, you know, a different class background. That would explain it. This isn't anything about race. That's what, you know, was the comfortable way of dismissing this, despite the fact the gap was so huge. But way back in 2015, HEFKI did an analysis of all the graduates that year, 280,000 graduates in 2014. And they controlled for entry qualifications, age, disability, gender, subject studied, school attended, and an area participation measure, which certainly outside London is not a bad proxy for socioeconomic group. Controlling for all those things brought the then attainment gap percentage point down 1 point from 16 to 15, almost no impact at all. Quite extraordinary. So all those things could not be the explanation. I've done a lot of work in Kingston, as I say, and we had a big OFS funded project working with 5 other universities, quite a mixture of universities. And our analysis confirmed all that. Class, you know, really, yes, minoritized students, certainly at somewhere like Kingston, tended to be more likely to be from one of the so-called lower socioeconomic groups, but that didn't explain in any way the difference in performance. So we could kind of dismiss all that stuff. So what I found, really what I've spent much of my time doing and what I found has been powerful is to hammer away at some of these messages. And we've developed at Kingston quite a sophisticated way of breaking down the data to course level. So I think quite a lot of people would say, yeah, I've heard about the attainment gap, but, you know, it's awful. But, you know, it doesn't apply to me and my students. I treat everybody very fairly. I do my very best for my students. I think, you know, I think all of them are doing well, etc., etc. When you can produce the data at a level of the course and you can demonstrate to people that they've got minoritized students coming in with the same entry qualifications as white students, but they're much, much less likely to succeed. When the staff see that it's their students, as it were, being failed, that's when they kind of, you know, take a big swallow and start to say, okay, you know, something's going wrong. We need to do something about it, but I'm not sure what. Now, sometimes I found it just getting people to accept that this is something that's happening to their students is a really important starting point. So people will begin to reflect, hopefully they'll begin to reflect on the curriculum, but that's helpful if that's an institution-wide drive. But also they reflect, I think, on their own behaviour in very simple things like learning people's names and who you go to in a seminar. And, you know, once they reflect on that, they start to see, yeah, that they're not really engaging with some of their students in the same way. And I think, you know, that's really quite an important starting point to get people to be reflective. And in my experience, you know, most staff do want to do a good job for their students. They want their students to succeed, but they get in this very awkward feeling that, you know, they're failing them, and are they being racist, and what can they do to help? And I think that's, you know, that's when your work at FACE comes in, that you've actually, you know, you're going to talk about how you've done mentoring and you've helped people to think through these issues and start to make changes. I would say that at Kingston we did reduce the gap, percentage point gap, from 29, which was absolutely appalling, to 11 during my time there. Okay, still pretty bad, but it did feel that the work on both an inclusive curriculum and, as I say, on just getting people to think about the way they were assessing students and whether that could be done in a different way, which was just as rigorous but gave people more choice, how they were treating students. If somebody didn't turn up to a tutor, rather than saying, well, that's convenient, it gives me a day off, actually being prepared to pursue that and address why that might be happening. So we had some success there. We didn't have all the answers, but the starting point for me was getting staff to accept that this was a problem not somewhere out there for HE, but a problem for them and their course and their students.
Thank you, John. Given that you're not feeling 100%, you took us through that really well.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. And that sort of therein sort of speaks to the power of FACE. And I think to pick up on your point, you know, as sort of a white person in the system, we do prioritise perhaps our own exceptionalism. Well, that can't possibly be me. And having been a member of FACE and learnt such a huge amount really about all of the possible microaggressions I was complicit in, whilst still wanting to think of myself as a sensitive and thoughtful person,
absolutely.
It was truly liberating. And I would definitely kind of recommend that space to just let go of the kind of narcissistic holding on to, well, that wouldn't be me. That's somebody else doing that, and just go, yeah, I need to immerse myself in the information with curiosity of what it is that I can do to improve. And these are the words of Claire, who's one of our co-creators of the initiatives that we are creating at FACE. We have essentially 4 toolkits that we felt would be really important as a kind of a national resource, and Claire and other students of colour have been encouraged to jump in and contribute their lived experience. And Claire, you know, speaks from the heart when she said when she says that she really doesn't want other students to experience the isolation and this unhappiness that she experienced when she felt she couldn't meet you know, with tutors on the project that she was trying to develop, because there was a wall, there was a white Eurocentric wall, and you know, bringing that down is a big part of the work that we're doing at FACE. I'm just going to
Can I just say, I think at Kingston we've made a lot of use of student curriculum advisors working with obviously willing staff, and that's been, you know, a really positive move for everybody involved. So working on an inclusive curriculum, working the staff together with the students has been, I think, one of the highlights, really.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's sorry, Caryn, go ahead.
You go, honey.
No, I was going to say it's just not one thing, it's multifaceted. And I think John, your analysis is fascinating, because we look at the success of, like you were saying, some marginalized, minoritized groups in FE or secondary school, and we see that actually they're outperforming. But what you then see at the HE level is that you have overseas students that then come in, which are slightly nuanced to maybe British Pakistani or British Chinese, etc., in terms of what that cultural sense of belonging is within HE. And I think this is a really important point that you make about understanding students' names and feeling that they see themselves reflected within the curriculum, but also the culture. So what we see is that the data that we usually have is usually at institutional level. We see that the attainment gap for any particular institution is maybe 16%, 10%, but we don't see it, like you've said, at course level. So we step away from that, like you're saying, Caryn.
Exactly.
Yes, it's not, I don't really have to do anything because
I'm doing a good job. I'm doing a good job. You know, it's not me.
Yeah,
else.
And it's the small details, I think, that make a difference, understanding those students at a module level, at a course level, which are really, really important. We do that to recruit, but we don't do that to progress. So we will go out to lower socioeconomic areas to recruit. We will go out to have a look at recruiting more people from marginalized and minoritized areas. But in terms of progressing them, then I think the work really does dry up. And I think that a lot of work that FACE does and the academics on there and the work that I do within my own particular institution is ensuring that those students feel that sense of belonging at course level. And then you do see the progression of students, because they think, oh, actually you're talking to me and not just the majority. And it might be 10 students out of 50, but those 10 students then do see a progressive rate. The interesting thing then is, and this is, I don't have an answer for this, is that when you do have a sense of inclusivity within your teaching and your sense of belonging, it also then does progress white students, which is a good thing, but still maintains that awarding gap. So the interesting thing for me is then how to elevate the most marginalized and minoritized group to then still compete, if that's the right term, with the top performing students. And I think that means that you have to ring fence them and understand the nuances, whether it be about financial difficulties, whether it be around first generation going to university, whether it be about the difficulties that some marginalized minoritized students have that are very different to their white counterparts. So I think it's really understanding at a course level that Black students are very different to white students, and in a way that you would look at a student that maybe had a disability and you would look at access for them, you really have to have a look at access, participation and progression for Black students to really concentrate this awarding and attainment gap.
I mean, the difference between schools and universities is, fascination to me, and somebody needs to do some research on it. But I mean, my kind of guess is that at schools, even big schools, staff know all the students. Yeah. They know them all, and a good teacher should know exactly how each student is doing so. University, I mean, it may vary on a smaller fashion course, maybe, but universities, when I went to university, I went to, lectures of about 150 people. Nobody knew who the hell I was. I could have disappeared, and that's a very different experience from being at school.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in something just off the back of what you were saying there, Pascal, and I'm going to look at Project 2. So we have members all over the country. Project 2 is led by Linda Mackey at Winchester School of Art. And she says that by co-creating with students of colour in focus groups to investigate bias, specifically for assessments, it was established that language, content, cost, and culture came out as areas for potential biased evaluation. Simple examples where expectation of materials as a sign of commitment rather than lack of materials being seen as a sign of a cost issue, simply because viewed through the eyes of an academic who doesn't understand that it's not possible to afford the right materials. So all of these are sort of taken into account to create a sort of step-by-step assessment journey to flag bias avoidance with findings, resources and proposals to support ongoing anti-racist work for all fellow academics. So each one of these projects, which we invite everybody to learn more about, are available. There's another, number one, the module building toolkit. This is led by Dean Liggett at Ulster, again working with a variety of academics, and this toolkit will provide building blocks to assist integration and embedding of module content, delivery and teaching and learning activities that are inclusive, transparent, decolonised and nurture unbiased content. And again, it's coming back to that recognition that as white academics, and of course we could be talking in a different perhaps identity sphere, that if we were coming from an able-bodied space and recognizing that different needs we needed again to understand.
We provide the same steps for everybody, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. But it is starting at that point for those of us who are perhaps recognizing our lack of cultural competency, our race deficit knowledge, to be able to move into a space going, yes, of course I'm bringing bias. Why wouldn't I? Because all of my learning, going back to my days of coming through academia, that was underpinned by white European referencing, resourcing, process. And so that space, I think, where we're all ready to move in a much more curious way towards the work of the co-creating with students is so vital.
I mean, bias in assessment certainly, is an issue to be addressed, but also it's worth doing some analysis on what forms of assessment, which are equal in terms of, academic rigor, which forms of assessment do certain groups of students do better at. And it's a case for saying, well, let's, and sometimes this is about giving students more choice as to what their project would be, for example, rather than specifying. So we did quite a lot of analysis in terms of ethnicity against outcomes on some methods of assessment. That was useful. And I think it was Derby who did some quite interesting work, had a project, which was to say they'd found that often students, they'd be set an assessment and did you understand that? Everybody would nod and go away. And then about 2 days before it was due in, somebody would ring up and say, I don't really understand this. And by then it was too late. And there was a feeling that it might be particularly some of the non-white students who were kind of reluctant in the class to put up their hand and say, actually, I don't really know what you're talking about. Can you explain further? So they did a project to set the project, send students away, get them all to come back and explain what their understanding of that project was, so that kind of they got to the bottom of that before they were sent away to actually work on it. And that was I thought quite a clever and simple thing to do, and obviously a benefit to all students. And I think you were saying, Pascal, it's quite, often these initiatives can benefit all students.
Yeah, it's a really good point, John, because I do that myself by using technology. I use a platform called Slido, which is anonymous, so that anonymity is really important for students not to feel othered within the classroom.
Yeah.
So what I have seen is that students will build my tutorial sessions by saying, I ask 3 questions. What did you totally understand? What didn't you understand? And what would you like further explanation on? So what I've seen is that I give, that kind of 3-pronged structure, which allows students to then tell me what they clearly understood, so I can understand what's really sticking, but also look at what's not understood. And it's not about just then looking at the individual black or white students, looking at the culture of the whole cohort and saying, okay, what is really being understood or not understood, and why is that? And I gather that weekly. And then that builds their tutorials to say, actually, before we go off and send you off and say, this is what you have to then. And many times, you're right, the assessment method is a 2,000 or 3,000 word essay, which doesn't always align with some of the different students' strengths. So I make sure that I'm looking at a kind of module level, that what is being understood. And I think sometimes that is missed, especially through the lens of fashion as well. It's kind of, will you understand this culturally, emotionally? And we had a great debate just today, around lots of what's been happening around the news and Kanye West. And the discussion was so varied. The discussion was so interesting, and understanding how do you see things through different lenses. And it's really, really powerful to understand that there's different views in the room, and to acknowledge and accept that is powerful, and empowers the students, I think, to hear their voice and say, actually, as a black person, I think this, but as a white person, I think this. And that's
a richness you need to draw on, isn't it? That's a richness you should benefit from.
Yes, yeah. It's needed, and it's been unfortunately missing from the conversations. And I feel it shouldn't take a black academic to be in the room to have these discussions. It should take all academics to understand the variety and the richness which is a part of any cohort. And of course, we're talking here about race, black and white, but also from other intersectional points of view as well is so important, and not just from the center point that says we are going to study fashion, how we've been taught fashion. So because we've been failed by academic systems from the age of 5 to the age of 18, whatever formative education you've had, we've learned in a certain way. So we teach in a certain way. And in a way, there's so much unlearning from an academic perspective that's needed to say, actually, just because I was taught like that, it took me a long time. It took me a long time to realize the way I was taught, how I was taught, possibly a lecturer stood talking to me for 2 hours when I went to university in the 90s, and then just taking all this information, and understanding all this language is limiting, not liberating.
Same as they did 200 years ago,
Exactly, yeah.
Really a powerful conclusion there, and I'm sort of mindful of time, so I just want to flag up resources. One of the projects that was undertaken and led by Joyce Thornton at Westminster for the all of the associates was the widening participation film Fashion Needs Colour, which is a national outreach tool for all institutions, and that's on YouTube. We've got the link there. And also, if anybody is interested in the breadth of academics and their conversations, there is also a film on YouTube about the FACE collaborations, and we kind of open our doors to interested academics to come and join, to get behind the perhaps to know that you're accessing the confidence to demand the change that we know needs to happen. And that's something, in closing, that you have noticed, isn't it, Pascal, that you no longer feel like you're the only person in the room demanding change.
Yeah, it's everybody's responsibility. And, you know, as the background says, we have to utilize our power, our position, our privilege, and our purpose. And what is the purpose of being an academic? It's to have inclusive teaching for all. We all have privileged positions, but it's understanding that and accepting that sometimes that doesn't serve everybody, and understanding that we have a duty within academia to teach everybody from many different perspectives. And sometimes that doesn't happen. And we're all in a position, we all have this power as an academic, the students coming in at a very young age, to say, like I've just said to mine a few hours ago, that you will feel more empowered and reflected by studying diverse curriculums, by having diverse academics stood in front of you, from looking at diverse techniques of how to study and methodologies. Like you said, John, not just having a 200, 300, 400-year-old process of what education originally was just to teach the very, very privileged. That can't happen. You can't just use a narrow section of books and reading lists. You can't just have a very non-inclusive academic program, curriculum, or staff. It has to be, and that's everybody's responsibility. So yes.
Yeah, thank you, Pascal. Thank you, John.
Can I just mention one side issue? I saw on your previous slide reference to the National Saturday Clubs. I did some work for them, and I went to their exhibition, summer exhibition they had this year. I thought it was absolutely extraordinary. The work, you know, that they got out was really amazing, and they are very much focused on minoritized students and more working class students, but the work was just fabulous. And I know Kingston is involved in that. I'm not sure, you know, how many others, but a lot.
Yeah, good to hear. Thank you. And I'm just going to add one other credit, because we looked at 4 groups of work, and there was one we didn't talk about, which is actually being led by a Central St Martin's student, now a graduate, Tegan Rush, which is the Radical Curriculum Decolonisation Toolkit. And that was for historical, theoretical and cultural studies, which takes the form of a conceptual map to facilitate critical reflection and discussion on racial equalities, and is a kind of growing pool of knowledge. So it really does give you the sort of range and depth of conversations that are being had nationally, that everyone can join in. And you know, Pascal, from your point of view, feeling that white academics can also join you in a space of saying we have to have change, we're fed up with the detours. That's an important part of what FACE is about, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's work in progress. I think there's so many good people doing so many good things. I think it's important to stay positive and look at the good work that's been done, but also not lose sight on the work that needs to be done as well in narrowing these awarding gaps and narrowing the attainment gaps. But beyond that, improving the culture within all the universities up and down the UK and worldwide, really. And I feel that these conversations, the FACE Summit, the 13th or 14th, are so important for people to just get another sense, another understanding. And this is both for academics and utilising the power of students, that many are coming and involved within these conversations, because sometimes they don't understand, because they've been enabled to think in a certain way through academia. I have never been taught by a person of colour. I have never seen myself reflected in a curriculum. So it took me a long time to realise I've been failed by my education. It was a moment where I thought, this is why I felt like this when I was at university. This is why I didn't really know what it was until I started doing the work and thinking, I don't see myself anywhere. And when you see that mirror and you hold it up into yourself, like you've both said, that academics are saying, oh, it's exceptionalist, it's not me, it's you know, it must be, it's bigger. But if we were to assume that racism or bias exists in society, then of course it exists within academia, and it's how we can lower that rate of race, that rate of bias. It's important to me.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect out.
Yeah,
John, Tatam, Pascal, Matthias, thank you very much.
thank you.
Pleasure.
Pleasure as always. Thank you.
And all strength to face.